Here's how to avoid stomach issues while running. Welcome to episode 250 on the Healthy Runner podcast, where we help you get stronger, run faster, and enjoy lifelong injury-free running. Today, Brooke Czarnecki, registered dietitian, nutritionist, is back on the show. She is the host of the Actively Fueled podcast and our resident RD on our Spark Healthy Runner team, who is going to troubleshoot the most common GI issues in runners. Brooke, thank you so much for coming back on the show to tackle this not so fun topic that can really plague many runners.
Of course. I'm so happy to be here, Duane. I always love when our podcast episodes land on like a whole number, like a landmark number.
Yes.
Episode 250. It's so fun. It's so
yes, great. 250, man, halfway to 500.
Yeah.
We'll always remember that moment. Remember that episode we did, halfway to 500?
We talked about poop.
There we go. This was the poop emoji podcast episode. So for our new listeners who haven't heard the other 9 episodes that you have been on, can you just tell our listeners who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a registered dietitian. I work primarily in the endurance sports space, primarily working with runners, but I do work with plenty of triathletes and cyclists as well. I also specialize in eating disorders and disordered eating among the athlete population as well. And I'm just all about, making sure that athletes are embracing a positive relationship with food while pursuing their athletic goals, because our long-term health is the primary most importance when we talk about just running and health, and nothing is worth sacrificing that for a goal or restricting food intake and stuff like that. So it's a little bit about me, and I don't think I missed anything, but happy to add anything else you think I missed.
Yeah, no, you're just like a wealth of knowledge, and I just love the fact that you do look at the athlete from a holistic standpoint, and it's kind of like how we look at the running community as kind of these 6 steps to growing in their running journey, and kind of the mental piece, the mindset is definitely one bucket. Today we're going to be filling like that nutrition bucket up with some goodies for sure, for those who are struggling with GI symptoms. But I love how you do look at the full picture in runners, and yeah, it's important. Like, running is one of the things that we do, but it's one part of our life. It's not our total identity and like the reason why we are on this earth, right?
Yes.
We are all humans. And I love that you help so many athletes kind of realize that and teach them to be kind to their bodies and nourish and, be able to take in the nutrition that their bodies really demand for their level of activity. So thank you for what you do. And I guess, really getting into today's topic, and this is one of those things that I think probably every runner has probably been there at some point already, right? Like, if it was just an easy run, if it was a race, having GI issues with running is never fun at all. And, if we could just kind of talk about like, what are some of the most common GI issues that runners do face?
Yeah, so I would say the most common issue is having GI distress during a run, whether that's like urgency to have to go to the bathroom, or like, sometimes like pooping your pants, or having to go multiple times during a run, whether it's like looser stools or more solid stools. Runner's trots is the term that a lot of people come up with and use to describe that. And I can't tell you how many people are like, I thought that was just a normal part of being a runner. And while like, isolated instances are maybe common, it shouldn't be something that is a chronic long-term issue. So this shouldn't be something that you deal with on like every long run or, multiple times a week. So runner's trots is definitely the number one thing that I help runners work through when we talk about GI distress. Secondly, another really common one is just nausea, or actually vomiting and getting sick during a run or a longer effort, more intense effort. And then the last one I see, and this doesn't necessarily pertain to like during your efforts, because these 2 things I just talked about, the runner's trots and the nausea, talking about during running. But outside of running, I see a lot of runners come to me and say, like, my doctor diagnosed me with IBS, either IBS-C or IBS-D. So I do see a lot of like IBS type type scenarios in runners as well in my practice.
And for IBS, what does that stand for those that don't know?
Irritable bowel syndrome.
Okay. And
Basically, it's a blanket term for when like people have either bloating, abdominal pain, food sensitivities, discomfort that aren't like recognizable through a certain diagnosis. Like maybe they got a colonoscopy and it came back clear. A lot of doctors will just say, "Oh, you have IBS." So it's a blanket term to kind of describe a lot of different GI issues.
okay, so they're having bloating, maybe having some stomach pain. Um, okay. All right. So that would be IBS. And yeah, runner's trots. I actually just talked about this in a previous episode that I had with Sarah, who you had connected us with. And I talked about my second marathon attempt where I did have race anxiety beforehand, which caused runner's trots.
Yes.
For my marathon, unfortunately, which was the first time that's ever happened during a race. And yeah, that was definitely not fun whatsoever. So, what are some of the causes of these common GI issues in runners?
So for the runner's trot specifically, usually it nutrition wise, it's a fluid or food intake issue. Um, a lot of times I'll see runners have these runner trots and they're not drinking enough fluids and or enough electrolytes on their runs. And I know we've talked a lot about just what proper fueling looks like during runs. And so people can kind of go back to those episodes after this one potentially. But dehydration is a huge, huge trigger for GI distress. Specifically like that diarrhea, that dumping effect syndrome where you feel like it's like all of a sudden you have major urgency to go and you like struggle to get to the bathroom. So dehydration is a big one. And then food, it could be potentially like a pre-run fueling issue. A lot of times I'll see athletes try to go out fasted because or like with nothing in their stomach before they head out for a run because they're worried about getting runner's trots, not knowing that that's actually making the problem worse. So pre-run fueling, and we can talk more specifically about that too, but just for general stuff as we enter this convo, pre-run fuel might be a little bit off, or even just like what you're consuming during your run might be off. And then finally, like what you're consuming throughout the day can definitely impact your, runner's trots too. So there's a lot of different angles that we can come at this from. And that's why GI issues can be really tricky to pinpoint down because they can be as a result of so many different things. So they can be extremely frustrating. And I know I've worked with a number of runners that are like, I have tried to figure this out for so long and I don't like, I try different things. I've, tried to keep track and it's just so unpredictable. And so it can be very frustrating. And a lot of times we just have to do a little trial and error to find out what's really going on.
All right. So it is due to multiple factors. I'm hearing that it could be the fluids, either being dehydrated and not taking in enough, or could caffeine have a role in that as well? Or
Absolutely. Yeah.
coffee?
Yep.
Because
Either
I know a lot
coffee
of
before.
runners use coffee before to make sure they go, right? Before a long
Yes.
run or a race. But do you find that those that have a history of runner shots, do you like advise them to not have coffee?
So it depends on the athlete. And usually it's a dose thing. So how much caffeine you're having. I mean, everybody's going to be a little bit different in their threshold and their tolerance for caffeine. But, if somebody is having runner's trots, like that's one of the first things that we might try to experiment having less of or saving until after a run. Because caffeine is like a gut motility agent, like it does move things faster through the gut. So that could potentially be a trigger for sure. But a lot of times I'm telling athletes, like, okay, let's try to decrease it first before we have to cut it out completely. Because we also know that caffeine is an ergogenic aid. So it can help us increase our performance. So it might not be completely necessary to cut it out altogether.
Right. Okay. And yeah, let's dive into that food issue a little bit more because can you just explain why if because I think that is pretty normal. Like if you've had a couple of experiences of runner's trots, you'd be like, well, it's probably something I ate. So let me just like run without eating.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know, maybe I'm subscribing that, I'm going to burn more fat as fuel and maybe that's good for my body. And you know what? It's not going to irritate, and give me like runner's trots. Like, why would that be a negative, or how could that potentially cause more runner's trots?
Yeah, so great question. And I'll kind of back it up, way up to what you're consuming before and the composition of that food. So oftentimes, I'll have athletes that are doing like a high protein or high fat meal before their exercise. And then they go into their run and they're like, I have this awful cramping, like things are just sitting in my stomach like a rock. And then again, all of a sudden it's either that abdominal pain and or it turns into an emergency where they have to go right now. And they're running for the bushes. And so what I'll tell athletes is we want to focus on carbohydrate rich foods that are low in fiber, and just, straight carbs. So like pieces of toast, a bagel, crackers, chips, something like that, where that's purely carbohydrates, low fat, low fiber, low protein, because those are going to be the most easily digestible foods that you can eat that are going to enter our bloodstream directly, for energy. Whereas if we ate protein, high protein meal, a high fat meal, or a high fiber meal, those things purposely take longer to digest. And there's absolutely a time and place for those, after we run, because we want to have that level of satiety after we eat. But for running specifically, it's just going to sit in our stomach. It takes longer to digest, and our body's not using that as an efficient energy source. And that's where we get a lot of those runner's trot issues if we're doing those like high doses of protein, fat, and fiber before we run.
Gotcha. That's right. Like, I don't understand how there are like literally some people could have like pizza before a run. And I'm like, the grease alone, right? And yeah, just, protein, fat content and grease. I'm like, I don't know. You must have like an iron stomach. But okay. So, all right. So we want to avoid kind of those foods, but really not fueling as
The not
well will
feeling.
be an
Mm-hmm.
issue.
It can potentially be an issue, especially for the longer efforts. Again, and it's similar to the fluid, part of it. So your gut needs energy. It needs fuel to be able to power these longer runs. And so if we don't have anything in our stomach, we get that nausea, we get that stomach upset and that discomfort. And it can cause your body to just basically go into a stress reaction. And then that stress reaction is causing the GI distress. And when we think about like fasted running and not eating before you head out on a run, people think that it will help them burn more fat and things like that. It actually doesn't do that. What it does, is you will start burning through your muscle stores first and not actually burn fat. So we actually need carbohydrates to burn fat. The saying goes, fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. And that's because we need carbohydrates to tap into that metabolic process to help us burn fat, if that makes sense. We're getting real sciencey here.
Yes, no, it does. And I think that's worth repeating is having carbohydrates will actually be the best way for you to burn fat, is what you're saying.
Yes, because
Because it kind of starts that process and increases the metabolic rate, essentially.
yeah, so it will help you tap into the fat burning process. So carbohydrates, or sorry, fat burns in a carbohydrate flame is the saying, as the saying goes. And that's how I like to think of it. And how do I explain it to my athletes?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And yeah, so that's runner's trots, kind of what causes that. How about that nausea, sickness feeling? What are some of the most common causes that you find in runners for why they are feeling nauseous or feel like they have to like vomit at the end of like a long run or a race?
Yeah, usually this is because they have waited too long to start fueling. And I like to explain it in this way. So when you start running, your body, even though you're not in like a fight or flight mode or like a life or death situation, that is what your body interprets it as. And so naturally, when we exercise, when we move our bodies, when we run, our blood is shunted from our gut and it's shunted into our extremities, our legs, our muscles. And so our gut doesn't get a lot of blood flow. And so when people start fueling like an hour into their long run and they suddenly get nauseous or they suddenly get sick, they're like, what the heck happened? And it's like, well, your body wasn't primed and ready to accept that fueling. And that's when we can start getting more of those nausea issues. And even like vomiting or again, even runner's trots because they waited too long to fuel. And that's because that gut doesn't have the blood flow necessary to start digesting and actually using those sources of fuel. So that's when we can run into the nausea and sickness during those longer intense efforts. And this is like when I work with my ultra athletes, this is one of the biggest problems that a lot of ultra athletes have is they're like, I'll get to mile 30 and then I can't go any longer. Like I just get too sick. And it's usually because they got behind with their nutrition, unfortunately.
Gotcha. I like how you phrased that because I've never heard you say that before, that it's kind of priming the system. So actually eating and fueling early and often will prime like kind of the GI system that kind of send some blood flow there so it can start like what it needs to do and start that process of digestion, so we can absorb those nutrients, use it for fuel, be able to actually run faster, further, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But okay, so if someone's getting behind and they're like, well, I don't need to because I've heard, I have glycogen stores. I'm going to have enough energy. I'll use that. I'm not going to need to fuel until an hour or 2 hours into my run. Like you're not priming the system, right? And now
Yes.
you're asking the GI system to actually start digesting food that you've, inputted into the system, but it has no blood flow to do that because it's sending it to your muscles so you can actually run.
Yes.
All
100%.
right. That makes
Yep.
sense. All right. Cool. I like that. Yeah, the priming concept. I think that's a great way to kind of talk about that and frame that, because that is so common. And I
Yeah.
just had an athlete the other day, who did a half marathon last week, and same thing kind of happened, is that nauseous feeling toward the end. And then once you start feeling that nauseous feeling, right, it's hard to actually take anything down because you feel like
100%.
literally I'm going to throw it back up. So then
Yep.
you just stop fueling when your body's like craving for that fuel in order to get to the finish line.
Yeah. And it's so hard once you're behind, like you said, to catch up because it's really hard to push through that mental block of nausea without, a lot of people have to stop and like really sit down for, a while and get their sorts gathered. But you don't really have the luxury of doing that in a half marathon, right? So it's really, really hard to catch up once you're behind.
Right. I've heard, a lot of ultra runners be able to do that, right? Like you can actually feel comfortable to be like, hey, I'm going to take 10 minutes at this stop and, see if things settle. Or I've heard of stories where people thought, their race was over, and then they did kind of wait it out, and then it passed, and then they were able to continue. But you're right. For a road race, typically, no one's going to like sit on the sidelines for 10 minutes and then be like, oh yeah, let me hop back in. Um, Hey, runner, want 4 free gels? Did you know that proper nutrition is one of the 6 steps to growing in your running journey? So if you've never eaten anything for your runs, or you've tried other gels, but you just didn't like the taste or quite frankly, the texture, or you always get stomach discomfort whenever you try to fuel your workouts, it's time to give Ucan a try. It is the fuel that allowed me to crush a 23-minute marathon PR, and Ucan is what powered my 48.6 magical miles in Disney as part of the Dopey Challenge. The top US marathon runners, whether it's Emily Sisson, Sarah Hall, or Emma Bates, all use Ucan to power their workouts and their runs. But it's not just for elite runners. As a running physical therapist and coach, it is my go-to recommendation for the athletes I work with. Now, Ucan is offering our Spark Healthy Runner community an exclusive chance to try 4 Edge samples for free. All you do is pay the cost of shipping. So just head over to ucan.co/healthy runner to claim this offer, or just drop Ucan in the comments and I'll shoot you the special link. And while you're over there, you might as well grab a box of energy bars. Salted peanut butter is my favorite, and I have it after my runs and before my strength sessions. As always, let's maintain a strong mind, a strong body, and let's just keep on running. Powered by Ucan. No, that's a good point there. And how about the IBS stuff? Like, what are some of the common causes to get IBS with running?
Yeah. So again, this is usually pertaining to like outside of those like during run fueling incidences, but oftentimes I see IBS type symptoms like food sensitivities, bloating, abdominal pain, with underfueling and undereating. And again, like your gut is a muscle. And so if it's not getting proper fuel, it's not going to process and absorb nutrients properly. And that's what happens with underfueling. And that's why we can get these dairy sensitivities or the gluten sensitivities, the bloating. And so, again, one of the most common things that seems intuitive to do is like, okay, I'll just start restricting. I'll just start cutting out different food groups. I'll, go on a dairy-free diet or a gluten-free diet. And it just makes the problem worse because you continue to restrict the food intake. But we're not actually addressing the root cause of the problem, which is just not having adequate fuel. So while we may need to temporarily stay away from foods that are giving us distress, the end goal should be that we add those things back in so that we have that wide variety in our diet and that diversity in our diet. So, what I'll tell athletes is like, a lot of times we have to push through this abdominal discomfort and this bloating to increase that food intake. And that's one of the hardest things that I ask my athletes to do is to push through. Oftentimes they have low appetite because of the bloating. So we're pushing through the low appetite. We're pushing through the constipation. A lot of times they'll have constipation with the IBS as well. And because again, we're priming that system to digest food and to absorb nutrients. So we need to push food through to actually have bowel movements and to make your gut work well. So I'll stop there because you probably have questions about what I've said so far. But underfueling is most commonly an IBS, or sorry, IBS is most commonly an underfueling issue.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I know you've talked about underfueling many, many times in our previous chats and some of the consequences, but I think you are highlighting it really well, how, it can really be a main driver and cause of many of these GI issues that runners face. So one more reason to not underfuel, so you can actually feel better in your stomach and your GI system. And what is this whole GI map testing? Because I've heard you mention it before. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Is that something that you would recommend for someone who would be struggling with IBS or like the runner's trots, or would it just be like an IBS thing?
Yeah, so the GI map is an excellent tool. Um, and I use it in my practice for clients we've gone through all the basics. Like we've increased their hydration, we've gotten their during run fueling nailed down. We've looked at their fiber intake, which we haven't touched on that, but oftentimes athletes are consuming crazy amounts of fiber and they just need to back off the fiber and their GI issues go away. So when we have addressed the fiber, we've addressed the intake during and surrounding exercise. We know that they're eating enough, but they're still having issues. That's when I might do something like a GI map, which is a stool test. It's the most humbling experience. It's like it comes to your door. It's a stool kit. You poop
It's
in a
like
hot
poop on a
dog.
stick.
It's literally poop on a stick. You poop in a hot dog container. It's seriously so gross. Um, and then you have to dissect like some pieces of your stool and put it in like a little petri dish container thing. And then you have the FedEx guy come pick it up. And that's what's funny to me because like they probably don't know that they're carrying your poop around. So yes, that is what we'll do. And the GI map will test for things like gut dysbiosis. So if we have an overgrowth of bad bacteria, or we have H. pylori, which is a stomach infection that can impact acid reflux, and H. pylori has a whole bunch of downstream effects with like iron absorption, nutrient absorption, test for things like parasites, worms, and then it also gives a really good picture of like your overall intestinal health. So again, how well you're digesting food, how well your body is responding to certain food triggers. So it's a really comprehensive test that I think can be super, super useful if we have tried all of the things and the basics just aren't working. But the thing to keep in mind with the GI map is that it's a tool. It is one tool that we can use, but we have to be treating the symptoms of the client and the patient and not treating the test. So sometimes the test will come back with like all of these things and it looks like it lit up like a Christmas tree, and it's like, okay, well, hold on a second, because you don't have all of these symptoms, so we're not going to treat all of these things if you don't have the symptoms of, for example, candida. That's another thing it looks for. um, so you kind of take the test with a grain of salt, and you really dissect the information that's on the test to address what's going on with the client. And that's why I always recommend, if somebody's going to do the GI map, they work with a dietitian who has extensive training in the GI map, so that you are getting a holistic approach and a full person approach and not just the test approach.
Got it. Wow. Okay. So for the results, what I'm hearing is it does need to relate to the actual symptoms. And if it's almost going to change the treatment, it's almost like when I look at like the musculoskeletal system as a physical therapist, it's like if someone gets an x-ray of their foot because they have heel pain and it shows a heel spur, like we all know that the heel spur is not causing the pain, but it kind of freaks someone out seeing like this huge heel spur on the bottom of their heel and thinking, hey, like, don't you need to cut that out in order for my heel pain to go away, my plantar fasciitis? Or like someone who has a meniscal tear and it's kind of like, hey, this comes up, but it might, or a labral tear in the hip. We have an athlete right now going through that where even though it does find a tear, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're going to treat that tear and go in and remove it surgically because it might not correlate with the symptoms that someone's having. So I kind of see some parallels there. But for this GI map testing, is that different from, or does it give different information from like blood work for food sensitivities? Or is it different?
Yeah. So it doesn't specifically test for food sensitivities, but based on some of the markers on the GI map, we can pull out if somebody might be struggling with food sensitivities, like if their immune response is down in their gut, or they have like eosinophil activation protein. That's one of the markers on there. If that's high, we can maybe infer that they're struggling with food sensitivities. But again, if that number comes back and it's like out of range, but they're not struggling with food sensitivities, I'm not going to say like, oh, you're struggling with food sensitivities. So it is very different than a food sensitivity test, a blood test, and I don't recommend those because those can also bring back false positives too. So yeah, definitely different, but that's a really great clarification too.
Yeah, and you mentioned the H. pylori. I actually had that number of years ago when I did have a little peptic ulcer.
Yeah,
They found that the H. pylori, but that was there. I definitely did not, because I think I would remember. I would definitely remember like pooping into like a hot dog container. I think it was like a breath type of test, right?
yep,
That I want to say I probably drank something and then had to breathe into a bag of some sort. Uh,
totally. That sounds right.
Repeated bouts or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, this GI map testing sounds pretty interesting. If someone was covering all their bases and really taking care of the fueling standpoint, they've been struggling with something like that. How does one go about getting a GI map testing? Does that need to be ordered from a physician or?
So I order them. Dietitians can order them. Anybody who is like a registered practitioner with GI Map or Diagnostic Solutions can order them for the patient. So it's really easy. It comes right to your
Nice.
door, usually within 24 hours. Even in Alaska, it came within like 2 days when I lived there. It's great. So
Nice.
yeah, it's legit.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, very interesting. Um, Yeah, thank you so much for kind of clarifying that. And for those that are kind of, wanting to learn a little bit more about how to kind of fuel for running, we do have a freebie download that Brooke has actually put together. It's an amazing resource in kind of how to eat as a runner. It lays out kind of how to fuel as a runner so you don't feel sluggish during your runs and you don't bonk during your race. And really what's included in it is our top 5 nutrition tips for runners, nutrition basics for running, the ultimate snack guide, and long run fueling strategy. So the best part, it is a freebie download. So you can get your PDF by just clicking the link in the show notes below or just going to learn.sparkhealthyrunner.com and you will see that nutrition blueprint. Highly recommend it. It's been very helpful to many of our clients. And as we get into talking about some solutions for some of these GI issues. It sounds like one of them is probably going to be like fueling. But what are some of like the misconceptions about these GI issues that you see in the runners that you work with?
Yeah, and we've already touched on a couple of these, but I think they're worth repeating. Is that like you need a restrictive diet to keep these GI issues at bay? Usually, again, I'm telling clients, like, if you have to be restrictive, something else is going on. Like, something else needs to be addressed. And usually, that root cause is potentially an underfueling and undereating issue. So, we need to address that first. And a restrictive diet is just going to keep you in that same cycle, that same frustrating cycle of um, having the GI distress. So, having the least restrictive diet as possible is always my goal for folks, because you should not need to be on a restrictive diet to keep these things at bay. And a lot of people get recommended, like a low FODMAP diet. And, man,
FODMAP. What is that?
So it's a different, oh gosh, I haven't had to explain the low FODMAP diet in a while. So it's different carbohydrate proteins. That's what I wanted to say. It stands for fructo oligosaccharide, something, something, something. There are different types of carbohydrate proteins
Okay.
that can lead to like GI distress. So part of the low FODMAP diet might be like avoiding onions or avoiding garlic. Like that's just one example, because those are potentially triggers in the gut. So a lot of GI docs, if they can't figure out what's going on with you, they'll just say like, you have IBS, go on a low FODMAP diet, try a low FODMAP diet, but they don't give them instruction on how to wean themselves off of the low FODMAP diet. It's meant to be an elimination diet where you then start to add things back in. But a lot of people will just continue the low FODMAP diet forever because they got relief and they're nervous to try something, like they're nervous to add foods back in. So that's a very often a recommendation that I hear about, and help clients kind of move off of the low FODMAP diet so that we can identify some triggers. But that's, one of the very specific examples of, a diet that might be recommended that is not meant for long-term use. It's meant for short-term use to kind of figure out what your potential gut triggers are. But again, backing up even further, why did we have to go on the low FODMAP diet in the first place? Usually it's because underfueling is an issue. And seriously, like 9 times out of 10, it's underfueling issue. But yeah, so we don't want to be more restrictive. The answer is usually they think we need to be more restrictive. No, usually it's why are we having to be restrictive and how can we work away from that?
Mm. Yeah, what a question I asked you, how to define that FODMAP, man. Those words were very long. Yeah, that that was a tough one. Sorry about that. I was like, FODMAP, what is that? Okay,
funny.
I basically got like a restrictive diet that's like specific for like onions, garlic, where you're just like avoiding those types of foods.
So many different foods.
That's good enough definition for me. Yeah. So, what are some other misconceptions?
Another one is that you need to veer away from gels and chews and rely solely on real food, quote unquote, real food for long run efforts. And I actually think this can backfire too. Some people have really great success with fueling with, just regular old food that's, bread, peanut butter jelly, things like that. But one of the pitfalls of fueling exclusively with non-sports related fueling is these things are really high in fiber and you need to eat a lot of them so the volume is increased, and that in of itself can cause GI distress. So like a high fiber diet can cause diarrhea during these longer efforts. And the volume, if your stomach can't hold a whole bunch, again, you're going to have that dumping syndrome effect. So oftentimes if clients want to fuel with regular food, I'm like, great, can we also embellish that with some sports products that might be easier on your gut? So oftentimes you have to marry the two together. It's not one or the other.
Gotcha. So a little combo platter, if you
Little
will.
combo platter, yeah.
Okay.
Which is so important.
Who isn't like a good combo platter, right?
That's right.
Get some protein, get some carbs, give you some spark. um, and then, yeah, anything else that you wanted to share in terms of like misconceptions for GI issues with running?
I think the last one is just, again, I said this at the very beginning, but worth repeating. A lot of people just think they have to live with this stuff. Like, you don't have to live with this stuff. Just because it's normal or just because it's common does not mean that it's normal. I mean, I think that, we can kind of play it up like, oh, it's just who I am, or it's just like, it's funny. It's just part of me. It's like, well, if you could do something about it, wouldn't you feel so much better during your runs without having to worry about where the next bathroom is, or worrying about where on the course your porta potties are going to be? You can get to the root of your gut issues. Oftentimes, it's just simple tweaks with your pre-run fuel or your during run fuel, hydration. So don't lose hope. Just because it's common does not mean it's normal.
I love that. Just because it's common doesn't mean that it's normal. So there are solutions, and it sounds like a lot of those solutions are really fueling your body in kind of a consistent way with the right types of foods that, talked a lot about high fiber today, avoiding those types of foods. But the more that you are fueling with the right types of fuel, then you're not going to feel some of this GI distress.
Yeah, potentially.
Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you'd like to mention relating to GI distress?
I would like to mention something outside of nutrition that I think can have a huge impact on the gut. Just overall stress and the stress
Mm.
load that's on your body. I actually was working with a client recently who's been running multiple marathons a year for many years, and when they started running marathons, didn't have any gut issues, and then suddenly, like a year and a half ago, started to get a lot of these like runner trot issues. Went through the whole gambit of like, I know that my pre-run fueling is good. I know my during run fueling is good. I know I'm eating enough. And I asked them, I was like, what's your stress bucket like? Like from, the time you started running marathons to now, what's your stress level? And it's much, much higher than it was before. They're managing a whole bunch of different things. And just also the accumulative stress of running multiple marathons a year for multiple years in a row with no break, that really has a huge impact on you as a person. And the overall stress bucket, and that will absolutely have GI impacts for some people. So that is also something that I like to point out, because I think a lot of athletes get really caught up in like doing as much as they can for as long as they can, but we got to play the long game here. Like if you burn yourself out, you're going to run into issues eventually. So we've got to make sure that we're managing, our training loads appropriately, and making sure that our training volumes and our training loads are matching what we're realistically able to do, given the season of life that we are in. So I thought that was, again, just a really interesting conversation that I had with a client a few weeks back. But I recently became a mom like a year ago, and this is a totally new concept to me of just embracing different seasons of life and being okay with adjusting your goals, your running goals given where you are. And I think that is huge. The stress thing is absolutely huge with the gut.
Yeah, that it's going to be huge with the gut, and it's also what I see a lot in the runners who get musculoskeletal injuries.
Yep.
And like the athlete you just talked about, I had one same exact story, who now has proximal hamstring tendon pain, that she hasn't had, for all the years of doing marathons, and the training wasn't all that different,
Yeah.
but it will catch up to you, accumulated stress, and not, being able to take those off seasons and take that base training phase and take a little bit of a break to allow the body to actually repair. So I think you're saying the same thing happens with the gut and, some of these GI issues that you're seeing in runners. So thanks for bringing that up.
100%. And it's a good reminder too that nothing occurs in isolation. That's something that I say to a lot of my clients too. They're having they have, recurrent injuries or pelvic floor issues or bloating issues, low energy, fatigue, and they're like, "Well, what the heck is wrong?" And it's like it's not just one thing. Usually it's multiple things, combined that is leading to this, big stress storm in your body. So nothing occurs in isolation in the body. It all works together. So I think that's a really good point just from your perspective too, like seeing the similarities and yeah, it's not just one thing usually. It's usually multiple things.
Yeah, and stress is stress, right? It's stress on mentally, physically. It's all going to have negative consequences. And you're right, it usually is multiple things. And a lot of times, we do see a lot of middle-aged athletes in their 40s and 50s, and they just think it's part of age and it's just
Mm-hmm.
aging. And it doesn't need to be like that. And just like you mentioned before, as far as, the GI issues of, it doesn't need to, it's not quote unquote normal. And there are things that can be done about that. So it just might not be the things that either people are willing to change or admit
Mm-hmm.
to, or put the work in that they need to, whether it is doubling down on sleep or doubling down on their mental health and some of those strategies to help reduce the stress, so then their bodies physically can feel better, whether it's the gut or other areas in the body, in terms of muscles, tendons, all of those things that I see a lot of. So yeah, this
Yeah.
was super helpful, Brooke. I really, really appreciate you coming on the show as always. And yeah, guys, just to kind of recap here, we really focused on kind of the most common GI issues in runners. We talked about runners' trots, we talked about IBS, we talked about nausea. And what are some of those causes, as well as the misconceptions, and how fueling is going to be that answer for most of these conditions. And I really want you guys to do a little reflection on, are you covering, did we describe you, and are you missing out in certain areas of your fueling or your hydration strategy for running, and do you need to look at those in a little bit different way? Like I mentioned before, we have the free download. If you've already kind of read up on information and you feel like, maybe your situation needs a little bit more one-on-one guidance, and you do want more of an individualized nutrition plan, to kind of nail down whether it's hydration, fueling with your running, or if you are struggling with underfueling, and so you can be able to run without GI issues, then you can work with Brooke one-on-one within our signature Healthy Runner coaching program. If you guys have listened to episode 211 on the podcast, or you want to know what it's like to work with Brooke, you can check out Rachel's story, which she shared how she got over not only her foot pain that she was having, but her underfueling issues, with the guidance of Brooke and myself, partnering up and teaming up to get her to her first marathon. So you can check out episode 211 if you want to learn more about Rachel's journey. And if you want to apply to work with Brooke, then you can simply go to learn.sparkhealthyrunner.com/coaching. And don't forget to get your free freebie download there. And yeah, Brooke, it's always a pleasure catching up. I always learn something new. You had some new terms for me today. FODMAP was one of them.
I'm
So
gonna have
I
to Google that to
appreciate.
make sure I explained it right.
Yeah, thank you as always for taking time out of your day to educate our Healthy Runner community.
Well, thank you, Duane. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and if you guys enjoyed this episode and you think it can help a runner that who might be struggling with, GI distress, copy the link wherever you're listening to this, share it with them to add a little info into their training, give them a little spark. Maybe they'll, have a little bit more carbs before their run so they can have some spark there. And as always, guys, let's maintain a strong mind, a strong body, and let's just keep on running. Until next time.